Scaling back your business was hard. Getting back may be harder. Penske can help get your business up to speed with confidence. While some supply chains have ground to a halt and others have struggled with heavy demands on speed and volume, Penske was working, monitoring every mile driven, every wrench turned, and every shipment delivered, giving them unique insight into the most challenging demands. See how Penske's practical innovation, custom logistics, leasing and rental fleets, and frontline experience can help at gopenske.com. From Transport Topics in Washington, D.C., this is Road Signs. Here is your host, Seth Clevenger.
Thank you for listening to Road Signs, the podcast series from Transport Topics that explores the trends and technologies that are shaping the future of trucking. In this episode, we're going to explore how trucking companies have adjusted how they operate to keep their drivers safe and their trucks rolling during this coronavirus pandemic. While many businesses have closed their doors and people have stayed home to prevent the spread of COVID-19, truck drivers have been on the front lines of this public health crisis. But how can fleets change their business operations to ensure that essential freight continues to reach its destination, while at the same time protecting their drivers and other employees? We'll set out to answer that question in this episode. During this pandemic, we've seen trucking companies distribute cleaning supplies and personal protective equipment like masks and gloves to their drivers, while also taking steps to eliminate the need for physical contact at shippers' and receivers' facilities. But that's just for starters. Later in the program, we'll discuss more driver safety tips and risk management strategies with Lilli Chiu, Assistant Vice President and Senior Risk Consultant at Hub International, a transportation insurance brokerage. But first, we're excited to welcome Dave Cox, President of Polaris Transportation Group, an LTL carrier that specializes in cross-border transportation between Canada and the United States. Thanks for joining the program, Dave.
Thank you so much for having me, Seth.
So it goes without saying that the COVID-19 pandemic has created a lot of hardship and disruption in the transportation industry, but I'd like to hear about your experience during this challenging time, especially since your company specializes in cross-border transportation. I think that's a good starting point. So the U.S.-Canada border has remained open for freight movement, but is closed for travelers. How has this situation affected your operations?
That's been very interesting. I think it's been interesting for many people and businesses around the world. We're fortunate enough in these unfortunate times to be considered an essential service. We really have not stopped our daily. We run a Greyhound bus schedule out of Toronto each night to our terminals in the United States and back. Nothing's changed with respect to our departures. Obviously, volumes are down a little bit, but it's been interesting. I think the nature of what our drivers do and truck drivers in general, they're kind of naturally self-isolated. Our fleet, unlike a lot of open board fleets, is my guys are going to the same terminal every trip. So they have access to facilities, clean facilities, and of course they're practicing safe protocols, procedures with respect to hygiene.
And I also want to talk to you about the role of technology during a crisis like this. And prior to this pandemic, your company had been investing in things like artificial intelligence and business process automation to help eliminate some of the repetitive tasks and reduce paperwork. So when you had to switch to this work from home office environment, how did those technology investments help you make that switch quickly?
It was fascinating. We literally created a virtual trucking company in about a day and a half. And yes, we made significant investments in robotic processing automation and artificial intelligence. The fact that my staff was used to working with these technologies, we literally went off site. 85% of my staff is working remote. You can't tell the difference if they were at their house or in the building. But, just a strong IT department coupled with, it's actually a partnership between our tech team and our HR team. They did a fantastic job. They mobilized the people. Our people were up for the challenge. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that, Polaris people are used to dealing with some higher end technology. And of course, robotic processing and artificial intelligence has already eliminated a lot of the mundane tasks prior to COVID-19. So in that respect, and again, in conjunction with the partnership of HR and our tech people, it was flawless. I was amazed and astounded, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I wish I was so productive working from home. Unfortunately, I haven't quite cracked that code yet. But I want to ask you a little bit more about this. Since this shutdown hit and you've moved to work from home for your back office workers, how have you been staying in close contact with your employees, and how are you managing, the operations with everybody working from home?
Yeah, that's the interesting part. It's you have a management style, or a style of managing your people when you're in house, and we had to learn. We utilize social media platforms like Zoom and Microsoft Teams. Our management from all levels is communicating on a daily, weekly basis with their individual teams, and that's really a key component of the virtual trucking company. Of course, there's the day-to-day work that we need to get through and the weekly work we need to get through, but it's also about, hey, how are you doing? Are you comfortable? Are you uncomfortable? And it may be related to work, it may be related to their personal lives. But I would think the fascinating part with all this is that we've become better managers. We're communicating better as a company when we're not in the building, and it's just been it's been pleasing and an unpleasing time.
Yeah, well, it's good to hear that. Of course, while some people can work from home, I'm working from home. Office staff is working from home. Truck drivers can't do their jobs remotely. Of course, they have to be out on the front lines, and it's just a job that requires somebody to be on site. So, what steps has your company taken to promote social distancing and safety for your drivers? What kind of tips and procedures have you implemented to help them stay healthy?
Yeah, good question. So essentially, those on site or on the road, of course, our drivers, our highway fleet, our local fleet, our dock workers, and a few people inside our building. By virtue of having more or less most people out of the building, we set up workstations, giving people ample distance apart from each other. Um, Dock workers, again, kind of naturally self isolating, provide them with masks, gloves, shields, sanitizing sprays, hand sanitizers, everything you could possibly think of. We've been very good at following physical distancing. With respect to my drivers, of course, we're crossing the border each night. We have sped up through the robotic processing automation and AI we have been using. We're preparing their paperwork actually much faster than we typically would. So we've got the documentation prepared in their driver's mailbox. So they can come in again a little bit. It all adds up, right? Less physical interaction between driver and dock, driver and perhaps whoever's left in the office. Makes people feel comfortable in an uncertain time.
Okay. And you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I was interested in maybe hearing a little bit more about the level of demand, freight demand that you're seeing right now. Of course, it really seems to run the gamut from certain consumer products that have spiked, partially driven by panic buying, but of course there's so many categories of freight that are just way down or off a little bit because of the slowdown in the economy. What type of volumes are you seeing right now? How much of an effect has it had on freight demand?
And we're probably off about 25% right now, which I think the industry is about 25-30%. Uh, Very steady at those levels. Noticed a slight uptick within the last week and a half. Last 8-9 weeks, moved a lot of personal protective equipment, a lot of parts that are going into ventilators, air purifiers. At the beginning, we were moving a lot of household goods that were, again, I think that came to the associated with the panic buying. And again, we're thankful. We have a lot of clients that are in considered essential businesses, and we're moving their products.
Scaling back your business was hard. Getting back may be harder. Penske can help get your business up to speed with confidence. While some supply chains have ground to a halt and others have struggled with heavy demands on speed and volume, Penske was working, monitoring every mile driven, every wrench turned, and every shipment delivered, giving them unique insight into the most challenging demands. See how Penske's practical innovation, custom logistics, leasing and rental fleets, and frontline experience can help at gopenske.com.
We've also heard examples of drivers encountering challenges on the road during this time. Examples include public rest areas that may or may not have closed. Restaurants, of course, have either shut down or have moved to takeout only, and that can pose challenges if you're a driver looking for a place to eat. Um, Maybe because of your operations, you've been shielded a little bit from some of those challenges, but what have you encountered? What are you hearing from your drivers? Have they run into any difficulties because of the pandemic?
Thankfully, and as you mentioned, just the way our fleet runs, heading to specific terminals every trip out, we really haven't encountered a whole heck of a lot. I would say at the very beginning, as our partners kind of figured out what the new normal looked like as far as interaction at their facilities, that was kind of the most challenging time. But our drivers have had access to clean facilities, washroom facilities. Again, they typically bring their food on the road. They're out, they go 500 miles, shut down for 10, and come right back to Canada. Again, naturally self isolated in their own truck, but we have been fortunate. We haven't experienced a lot of the hardships many other carriers and drivers have had to face.
Well, that's good to hear. And we've been through this long enough at this point that I think we're now at the stage where we can really begin to think about what our industry and what supply chains will look like after this pandemic. And I just want to get your thoughts on what kind of longer lasting or enduring changes do you envision for distribution networks? I mean, what what's going to change longer term?
That's another good question. We've talked a lot about this at Polaris. I think on the short term, I think supply chains will need to be replenished as we slowly reopen. And I think a bit further down the road, I think of how North America was caught off guard by, you know, having access to a lot of necessary products. I could see more manufacturing being done in North America, be it the United States, Canada, or Mexico. I could see manufacturing distributors carrying larger volumes than they typically would in their supply chain. And I think they'll probably have those inventories in strategic places throughout North America. We've spent probably last 30 years focusing on globalization. I see more manufacturing coming back to North America. Again, um, I think Polaris and probably many other trucking companies will be are well positioned to enjoy the demand that will come with the new supply chain practices.
Got it. I know that there has been discussion in manufacturing circles about nearshoring for some time, but it does feel like it could be the impetus for maybe giving that a little bit more momentum. Um, Another question, of course, is really not just in transportation, but across the workforce. Will more people, stay working from home? Is that going to become, at least for a certain percentage of the workforce, the new normal? What are your thoughts at your company? Do you see more of your staff staying at home, or do you anticipate getting everybody back to the office eventually when the time is right?
Yeah, I definitely see more people working from home in the future, specifically at Polaris. We have, interestingly enough, we have a daily pandemic meeting at 2 o'clock each day, and it's made up of my chief operations officer, my chief human resource officer, chief technology officer, many senior leaders. And one of the topics of late is as COVID-19 is somewhat calmed down. I guess I don't think that's the right thing to say, but we're weeks into this now. But the conversations turn to what does Polaris look like in the future? I definitely see people working from home. Again, we've created a virtual trucking company. We have technologies that allow us to work from home. That said, I think there people need interaction amongst their peers. So I don't know. Is it everyone's out of the building? Do we bring them in teams? That's to be worked out. But definitely Polaris, uh, my people will be working remotely.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. And before I let you go, just wanted to give you, one final opportunity for any additional thoughts you have about what it's been like to go through this very unusual, strange, and really challenging chapter in our history, and what you think the future may hold.
It's you start each year with a vision, and it's very much a sales vision, a tech vision, an HR vision, whatever the vision is, right? That's kind of where my mind was going
Mhm.
at the end of last year and the start of this year. I guess from a Polaris perspective, I learned a lot more about my company, and I learned a lot more about my people. I always knew we had good people, but when you saw people of all rank and file, it didn't matter what your title was, if you're the president or if you were working on our dock, people came together. I saw goodness in people, and sometimes in business, maybe you maybe I haven't appreciated that as much as I should have. This pause, if you want to call this a pause, is really inspired me. That hey, we have a fantastic team. And I'm looking forward to celebrating the team as we move beyond this. And also, one last thing is that one thing I've said for years: truck drivers in general. This is a serious profession. It needs to be seen throughout North America as a profession. And it's sad that it's taken a pandemic like this for people to really appreciate truck drivers. And they need to be celebrated more. So good thing, bad thing. I'm glad they are now being celebrated. I hope it continues when we get ourselves out of this mess.
Well, we can all hope that this lasts. Has been great to see the sort of outpouring from the public and greater recognition for the jobs done by essential workers and frontline workers, and of course, truck drivers are absolutely a core component of that. But this has been a really good conversation. I really appreciate the insights into how you've experienced this at Polaris, but I think this is a pretty good stopping point. So I'll let you go there. But thanks again, Dave, for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Seth.
In times like these, it's crucial to stay informed. Transport Topics is offering all the information you need to make business decisions in these unprecedented times. And in the wake of the many event cancellations and group gatherings, TT ensures a virtual way to consume business content and conversation. To join the conversation and stay ahead of the news, follow Transport Topics on all social outlets or by visiting ttn.ws/stay informed.
Next on Road Signs, we're excited to welcome Lilli Chiu, Assistant Vice President and Senior Risk Consultant at transportation insurance brokerage Hub International. Thanks for joining the program, Lilli.
Thanks, Seth. I appreciate you having me join your podcast and happy to be here.
So, your company created a helpful list of tips for drivers and other frontline workers in the transportation industry so they can really stay safe during this pandemic. A big part of that, of course, is social distancing. Obviously, truck drivers don't have the option of working from home. So, what steps can they take to avoid or minimize close physical contact with others?
Yeah, I guess you could say, for the most part, at the start of the pandemic, the emphasis has always been practicing good hand hygiene. And that's where the key source of the spread of the virus starts. And limiting close contact with others and at other high surface areas. So I think for the time being, we've kind of navigated ourselves throughout this pandemic for the most part, and keeping up with the basic personal hand hygiene is key, as well as social distancing and physical distancing, which has now become more part of our regular, practices, everyday life, whether it's working, driving, or being at home. So some of the tips that drivers can take and really is at the forefront of their daily shift is washing their hands often with soap and water or any alcohol-based hand sanitizer. Sneezing and coughing in their sleeves. Most importantly, avoid touching their eyes, nose, and mouth. And also, what's most important, and I think what's kind of left off of the whole safety measures, is also maintaining that self monitoring and making sure if you're feeling sick or having any cold or flu like symptoms, it's also to be sure and to be monitoring that, because you do not want to be working and would like to obviously communicate that with your supervisor.
And we've heard from several companies over the past few weeks and months now that drivers, at least initially, encounter some challenges out on the road with certain public rest areas closing. Of course, restaurants are closed or moving to takeout only at this time. So that creates some challenges from a route planning perspective. Just hey, where do I go to rest, to eat? How do I plan that? What's your advice for drivers who are trying to navigate that challenge?
I think you brought up some really key points in terms of uncertainty, change, disruption, and I think for the most part, drivers really need to have that support system from their dispatcher, their supervisors, and relying on their quote unquote lifeline to get them down to the next stop that they have. So in terms of what drivers need to do, it's really making sure that companies have that support with communicating any of these changes, planning their routes ahead of time. Um, in my experience during this pandemic, we've worked with a lot of different companies, and often companies are actually providing some solutions to really help care for their drivers. And knowing the route is one thing, but knowing if there's any limited options for food. We've seen some companies actually pre-package some takeaway food or full meals for them, just so they don't have to be in a bind when being on the road. So they do have some food and some healthy options with them. So in terms of what drivers need to kind of keep aware of, it's really leaning on their support system with dispatch and supervisors, and making sure that they're connecting them with the right proper routes, and also that communication is key. So drivers reaching out if there is things that they've come across in terms of their route, or know that there's any service areas that are uncertain to be open or closed. It's really communicating that to their dispatch and their supervisors.
A lot of coordination on the back office end as well to make it easier for drivers. We do hear that certain locations, of course, have seen disruption, delays at certain shippers and receivers facilities, which is to be expected with this much volatility and this much of a shakeup in the supply chain. But before we leave this topic, I do want to kick it back to you for any other advice you might have for frontline workers like truck drivers.
Advice for frontline workers, our drivers are at the forefront of this pandemic, along with all the other essential workers that are continuing to work during this crisis. And I really think, we're entering a transition period of opening up or loosening some of these restrictions. But what's most important and what is the focus for drivers is really adhering to the physical safety and well-being that they need to take pride in, and really following the social distancing, physical distancing, the cleaning procedures, the hand hygiene. All of these things combined together will help them to really reduce their exposure and staying safe and healthy during this crisis. Along with drivers is also working with their support system, which is dispatch and fleet supervisors. So combined together, I think companies have really come together to really bring safety and communication as a focus, and it's really nice to see that happening, especially within the industry.
And speaking of fleet managers, what can the management set do? What can the executives at trucking companies and the leaders of trucking companies be doing to help protect their drivers? Drivers, of course, have an essential job to do, and they can take away some of these tips, but what can fleet executives really do to help support that?
Well, I think it brings up this crisis does bring about a lot of different things that some companies are doing well and some companies aren't, or some companies are actually succeeding in. But I think it really comes down to the basic pillars of communication tools. Elevating different options for communication is key. Obviously, the focus is the drivers, and making sure that there's that connection and driver engagement with new directives, new safety precautions, several different ways that we can help support them while they're on the road. I've come across some companies that are actually really taking it to the next level, which is the wellness and the mindset of drivers. I do know one company that is focused on wellness and video recordings that are sent out and communicated on a daily basis to make sure that they're coping mentally well with the crisis and all the feelings that come about with this uncertainty. So one thing is elevating communication tools, focusing on driver engagement and making sure that they feel safe and they have the proper equipment and support. And also keeping up with all the new directives that are happening right now, crossing state border lines and making sure that there's any uncertainty or any confusion or any unknown, that drivers have that support system with their company to provide them with the next best steps.
Very helpful, I think, advice for all the fleet managers out there who are uh, figuring out the best way to manage this. Of course, trucking is a very fragmented industry, lots of small and medium sized companies all going through this and trying to find the best way to keep their drivers safe. I also want to talk about, of course, the insurance and risk management element of this pandemic. Of course, that's your core focus at Hub International. So I want to get your thoughts on this big question mark that's out there about how does this play into insurance issues like workers' comp. Any advice that you have for all the businesses out there?
Yeah, I guess in terms of insurance, we're always looking at what is the worst case scenario, and being prepared for that worst case scenario. And I think for every company right now during this crisis, whether they're operating or whether they're looking to reopen their operations or their business, I really think the worst case scenario would be an actual outbreak of coronavirus within their company and their employees, and obviously affecting their drivers. So I think companies really need to, naturally we're wanting to limit the exposure and protecting our staff and drivers, but more so, it's also protecting our business and our operations. So we've done everything right. We've seen companies really elevate their safety protocols, communication, and support with their drivers. But it's also sticking to that and maintaining these new practices as we continue on with stabilizing and kind of maintaining this new normal. So in terms of drivers, they're our focus for every company that's operating right now, and making sure that they're safe and healthy to continue on. So I think in terms of risk management and insurance, it's protecting our staff and employees, and making sure that there isn't any type of outbreak within the company. And I think we're all armed with the right communication directives, equipment, and training that is always instilled within companies. And Hub actually really helps our clients with putting these practices into place, and supporting them in their efforts.
Got it. Well, we've certainly talked a lot about a lot of different steps that fleets can take. Any other examples of mitigation strategies to prevent risk or prevent outbreaks that we haven't discussed yet? Anything else? Any other final tips that you can add that uh, fleets can write down as an idea?
I think really it's really coming together, and coming up with new strategies and communication tools, and really adapting to these changes. I don't think obviously it's unprecedented times. There's no written playbook on how to navigate this virus. So it's really paying attention to what the company is doing itself, but also paying attention to what other companies are doing within the industry. And I think being innovative and fresh and new, and really genuinely taking care of our drivers is key. So whether it's through communication, whether it's through being thoughtful about planning routes or shift changes, or taking the extra mile, and providing packaged food for them. All these little things collectively really help to keep people safe, and ensure that their safety and well-being is a priority.
Sure. And where can listeners go to find some of the resources that you've put together on this?
Well, listeners that can actually go on to our hubinternational.com website. There's a link to our coronavirus resource center, and they can tap into the resources there.
And before I let you go, I just want to ask you a kind of a longer term question. I don't want to ask you to speculate on how long COVID-19 will be with us, but do you think that some of the health precautions we've been talking about that we've implemented really across our society during this pandemic may stay in place for the longer term? How much of this is going to be temporary, and how much is this going to be a new normal?
Well, I guess that's the burning question for everyone out there right now. Is how long will this continue? What will it look like? I think right now we're really just seeing what it is day by day. It is a global pandemic, so I think as much as we want to look ahead, which is always great to do, to kind of see what best things we can do to put in place to prevent exposure and risk. Uh, but for the time being, my thoughts on this is that these precautions and these protocols we've put in place will be here for quite some time, until there is a vaccine, until we better understand the virus. So I think really right now it's really important to be vigilant with safety protocols, hand hygiene, and maintaining physical distance, and making sure that you're listening to that voice in your head and saying safety is a priority right now.
Well, this has all been great advice, and I think very good food for thought for all the companies that are going through this. So I really appreciate your insights, Lilli. I think this is a good stopping point, though. So we'll wrap it up there. Thanks again for joining the podcast.
Great, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Did you know you can ask Alexa to open Transport Topics? In just 1 minute, you will hear the biggest trucking headlines of that day. Be prepared and start your morning off right with Transport Topics.
Before we close, let's take a moment to revisit our original question. How can trucking companies adjust their operations to ensure that essential freight keeps moving while at the same time protecting their workers? As we've heard from our guests, fleets can implement a number of measures to help prevent their drivers and other employees from contracting the virus. Frequent cleaning of truck cabs and surfaces at docks and terminals is becoming a standard procedure. Social distancing in warehouses and at shippers and receivers' facilities is another important step. And careful route planning can help ensure that drivers will have access to food and safe places to rest. Meanwhile, many trucking companies' back office employees have been working from home during the pandemic. Technology investments that support business process automation can ease that transition to a work-at-home environment and help ensure that essential freight arrives on time. As states begin to ease restrictions and more businesses continue to reopen, many of these safety and cleaning measures established by transportation companies can and should remain in place. In fact, it's likely that some of the steps taken during this pandemic will become a new normal even after we emerge from this crisis. If you've enjoyed this episode of Road Signs, please let others know. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If my questions have sparked questions of your own, share them with me and the Road Signs team. You can email us at share@ttnews.com. We'll read them and respond daily. And of course, we'll be back in 2 weeks with a fresh episode of Road Signs. Until then, I'm Seth Clevenger. Thank you for listening.